So, Mike, let's talk about in more detail sort of the virus, the vaccines, some of the known knowns with it, some of the known unknowns with it, and how we're seeing the timeline play out.
The vaccine distribution and the administering of vaccines, it's going okay. I think that's sort of the best you can say. In many areas of the world, it's been disappointingly slow and nowhere near the levels of vaccinations that are baked into a lot of the economic forecasts and even market forecasts for the year. So some areas disappointingly slow. In the US, it's just going okay. The bottleneck at this point, there isn't a shortage of vaccines. The bottleneck has been the distribution and the administering of vaccines. So we're sort of at the point where even if we were to get 500 million more vaccines right now, that actually wouldn't really increase the pace of vaccinations all that much. It'd be great news, but it's the distribution and the administering of the vaccines that really is the bottleneck. So it's been frustrating. We touched on this in the outlook. We're going to make progress, but there are going to be hiccups. There are going to be delays. There are going to be anti-vaxxers, all of this. But the important thing is the signal in our outlook is still very strong. There's a lot of noise, but the signal is strong, and we think we're still sort of on track to hit those key points in our timeline that are going to allow us to get much closer to how we used to live life prior to COVID.
And right now we're on a 2 vaccine dose path, but with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that could just be a single dose variant to be able to speed up the process. But even with that, we're still probably not going to beat this timeline we have here, but should stay in line with it. And then I think I read perhaps that by next year that we'll have the capacity to produce some 10 plus billion doses of vaccine in any given year. So we're going to have more than enough vaccine. It's just getting it into people's arms that really is the challenge here.
That's exactly right. And looking at this timeline, what are the key things for us for this timeline as it pertains to our economic outlook and our market outlook? And the first thing is understanding that the overwhelming majority of hospitalizations, severe cases, and deaths come from the over 65 population. About 80% or more of the hospitalizations and deaths are for those over the age of 65. And even at the current pace of vaccinations, and even with assuming that these vaccines these projections don't include J&J, so these are all 2-shot vaccines on this timeline, we think somewhere around May you will get to the point where everyone over the age of 65 that wanted to get a vaccine could have done so. And so at that point, this becomes a far less harmful situation, and hospital capacity opens up significantly. If you can vaccinate the portion of the population that's responsible for over 80% of the hospitalizations and the deaths, then what you have left is something that's sort of like case counts. You would look at rising case counts and say, oh, well, that's younger people out getting the flu, is basically how you would start to view it. And hospital capacity would open up quite a bit. We think we're on track still, where when we get around the May timeline, you're going to open up a lot of hospital capacity. The death rate will probably fall by at least 2/3 once that at-risk population is vaccinated, and the hospitalization rate should fall by at least 1/3.
Do we have any idea, number one, as to like what percentage of the over 65 population won't want to get the vaccination? And then, how do those case counts impact the hospital system if they're actively not getting the vaccination?
Yeah, that's very difficult to say. So a lot of surveys have been sent out. And they range from anywhere to 50% of the population to 80% of the population. But this is a very path-dependent question. So if we continue to make progress and folks in this sort of at-risk age group see their friends getting vaccinated and don't see any problems or side effects, and then we get to the point where it's, I need a vaccine passport in order to do the things I want to do to live my life, then we think the vaccination rate will be much higher. It really depends on how the rollout goes. The other thing, you look at at vaccination rates for this group, in particular for the flu vaccine, and they're relatively low. But the flu vaccine is not as effective as the COVID vaccines have been tested thus far. So it's a totally different story. If you say, you get a flu vaccine and there's still a 40% chance you get the virus, well, that's not as exciting as a 90% effectiveness for some of these COVID vaccines.
There are a whole host of other vaccines in the pipeline. Maybe just comment on all the other ones that are in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and anything promising or worth noting there.
Yeah, a laundry list of vaccines that are coming out, all of them with different technologies. The most important thing here is, there's no hope that any of these are going to be more effective than the Moderna or the Pfizer. I mean, the effectiveness was basically off the chart. But what this shows is we basically diversified the production going out a couple years. And that's how we get to producing these vaccines on a large enough scale that we can hopefully defeat the virus. So it's important that you have a diversified portfolio of vaccines, and that's definitely what we have. The only not so encouraging news was Merck decided to cancel their vaccine altogether. Very disappointing test results. So that was a bit on the disappointing side, but still a number of other candidates.
Maybe share with the viewers the results from the Johnson & Johnson trials that we've studied.
Yeah, the Johnson & Johnson results recently came out. They had one of the largest studies. They're a single shot vaccine that just has to be refrigerated, so no freezing and thawing. So the good news is effective at preventing 100% of deaths due to COVID. They had a very large trial. You take the worst case scenario off the table if you get a Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is what they're saying. And about 85% effective in preventing severe cases that would likely require hospitalization. So that's great. But only about 65% effective at preventing infection. So a far lower mark than what the Pfizer and the Moderna said from their tests, which was over 90% effective in preventing infection. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we don't view it necessarily as a game changer, and we're not even going to get doses until June. At that point, we hope that the over 65 population is vaccinated anyway. But a single shot vaccine that doesn't have to be exactly, especially for the not at risk population.
Right.
A lot of younger people back half of the year, the J&J will be what they get.
And was there any data on the effectiveness duration of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
On all the vaccines, that is a known unknown. We know that the Moderna and the Pfizer in particular create such a large immune response that antibodies have been present based on the patients that were in early trials. They've been present for a very long time. So that's encouraging. And the big thing is we don't need immunity forever. We just need to get at least 12 months so this inoculation can be weaved into a seasonal flu vaccine. That's sort of, once we get there, it's good enough. And it seems like we're getting there.
The two variants that we've seen in the US from the UK and from South Africa, like what impact have those had? Are we really seeing the impact of those yet? And what's the expectation of how some of these vaccines will work on those variants?
Yeah, the UK variant, the overall conclusion is this is far more infectious. It transmits much more easily, so it can become the dominant strain relatively quickly, but it's not any more lethal than the standard variants that we've seen thus far. And also, the large vaccine companies have come out and said that their vaccines are just as effective in terms of preventing severe cases and deaths on the UK variant as they are on other variants. So, can spread more rapidly, but not more lethal, and the vaccines are just as effective. The most concerning variant from our point of view, the biggest known unknown and risk that started to get priced in a little bit in January, is the South African variant. That variant, we've seen vaccine makers come out and say that they have shown that their vaccine is less effective at producing antibodies versus the South African variant, significantly less effective. So for example, Moderna did a study on the South African variant. They showed that their vaccine produces 1/6 as many neutralizing antibodies versus the South African variant as other variants in the trial. So that face value is alarming. 1/6 the number of neutralizing antibodies. That's still enough antibodies to prevent most infections and prevent most severe cases, but Moderna has acknowledged, the need for some type of a booster shot if we're really going to help out against the South African variant. So that definitely is the most alarming variant for everyone's outlook during 2021. We've only seen a couple cases here in the US, but we don't do a great job of genetic sequencing relative to other countries here in the US. So it's quite possible that there are far more cases already in the US
Right.
that we just don't know about.
And what about the research/information we're hearing about other potential variants and how those might emerge and be identified?
Yeah, the virus has been evolving at a pretty steady pace. So just about 2 mutations or 2 variants per month. What is alarming is some of the variants now, particularly the one in South Africa, being more lethal. That's the thing we worry about the most. So the hope is if you can get the virus to stop replicating, i.e. stop spreading, you can get it to stop mutating. And so all of this just stresses the importance of vaccinations and herd immunity and getting there as quickly as possible. Because if we can get it to stop replicating, we can hopefully stop some of these more dangerous mutations.
If we have anybody who can sort of tell us forward-looking information as how the response has been to the vaccinations, talk about what's going on in Israel.
Yeah, Israel is definitely the leader in terms of shots administered as a percentage of the population. So over 50% of the Israeli population now has received at least 1 dose of a vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine in particular, and they have really tremendous medical records, electronic medical records. So they are what we are watching very closely. We're getting to the point now where about 20% of the Israeli population has received 2 doses. And that 20% is in the mostly in the most at-risk part of the population. So, we have this outlook in the US that once we get enough of the at-risk population with 2 doses in their arms, you should break the link between cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And we're getting to the point in Israel where we should be seeing that relatively soon. So that's what we're watching very closely. We're looking at the relationship between case counts in Israel, hospitalizations, and deaths. And we obviously want to see case counts go down, but more importantly, we want to see hospitalizations and deaths go down to show, hey, this is how this is going to work. This can be a model for other countries. We're arguably right in the sort of next wave of countries that can get to that point. So that's what we're watching very, very closely.
And as sort of we embark on the vaccination path here in the U.S., talk about the sort of the challenges the government and private business has with requiring a vaccination for people. We've heard about this COVID passport you mentioned earlier. What are the challenges with both private business and government in terms of requiring these types of vaccinations?
Yeah, you certainly can't mandate that people go out and get a vaccination. That would be unconstitutional. But there are a number of private employers that can stipulate employment based on whether or not you get a vaccine if that vaccine is critical for you to perform your job function. So, and there are also a number of private businesses that can require a vaccine to use their service or proof of a vaccine. So, we're going to get to the point, most likely May, summertime, where a lot of folks are going to say, yes, I actually now need to get a vaccine or else I can't live my life the way I want to live it. And maybe they'll begrudgingly get the vaccine. And that's good news, bad news. But it's still going to be very important for us to get to the end result, which is putting this whole thing behind us.
Thanks, Mike, for sharing all that great information, and thanks to our research team who's really been digging into these numbers. And we'll be back with regular updates on our outlook for the virus and the vaccination effort. So till then, be safe.